The Palestine issue. The Palestine issue is one of the longest and most unresolved conflicts in modern history and a major test of the United Nations' credibility. The roots of this issue go back to the early 20th century, when Palestine was under British control after World War I. In 1947, the UN proposed the Partition Plan, Resolution 181, which recommended the creation of two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. While Jewish leaders accepted the plan, the Arab side rejected it, arguing it was unfair and violated Palestinian rights. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, an event known as the Nakba, catastrophe. Since then, Palestinians have lived under occupation, displacement, or refugee status, while Israel gradually expanded its control over Palestinian territories, including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War. The UN has passed numerous resolutions calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories, protection of Palestinian civilians, and recognition of Palestinian self-determination. However, these resolutions have largely remained ineffective. A major reason is great power politics, particularly the repeated use of the United States veto power in the UN Security Council to block resolutions critical of Israel. This has prevented meaningful enforcement actions and weakened the UN's authority. Another major challenge is the continuous expansion of Israeli settlements, which violates international law but continues without serious consequences. These settlements fragment Palestinian land, making the idea of a viable, independent Palestinian state increasingly unrealistic. Additionally, internal divisions among Palestinian leadership, especially between Fatah and Hamas, have further weakened the Palestinian position on the global stage. Pakistan has consistently supported the Palestine cause, does not recognize Israel, and advocates for an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. Through platforms like the OIC and the UN General Assembly, Pakistan has raised its voice against Israeli aggression and human rights violations. Despite global sympathy and repeated UN debates, the Palestine issue remains unresolved, highlighting the UN's inability to act decisively when powerful states are involved. The Kashmir issue. The Kashmir issue is another major unresolved conflict that directly questions the effectiveness of the United Nations. The dispute began in 1947, at the time of the partition of British India, when the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was left to decide whether to join Pakistan or India. Despite having a Muslim-majority population, the ruler acceded to India under controversial circumstances, triggering the First Indo-Pak War, 1947-1948. The UN intervened and passed several resolutions, most notably UN Security Council Resolution 47, which called for a free and fair plebiscite to allow the people of Kashmir to decide their future. A ceasefire was established, dividing Kashmir into Indian-administered and Pakistan-administered regions. However, the promised plebiscite was never conducted. One of the biggest reasons for the UN's failure in Kashmir is the lack of enforcement mechanisms. While resolutions were passed, the UN lacked the power or political will to force their implementation. Over time, India shifted its stance, insisting that Kashmir is a bilateral issue, particularly after the Simla Agreement of 1972, which emphasized bilateral dialogue and reduced the UN's role.
The situation worsened in August 2019 when India revoked Articles 370 and 35A, removing Kashmir's special status. This move was widely criticized for violating international law and human rights, yet the UN response remained largely limited to statements and discussions. Human rights abuses, prolonged curfews, communication blackouts, and demographic changes have continued with little accountability. Pakistan has consistently raised the Kashmir issue at the UN General Assembly, UNHRC, and OIC, emphasizing the right to self-determination for Kashmiris. Despite international awareness, the UN's inability to enforce its own resolutions has made Kashmir a symbol of institutional weakness and selective justice. Failure of the United Nations. The United Nations was created to maintain global peace, prevent wars, and protect human rights. However, its repeated failure to resolve major conflicts like Palestine, Kashmir, and Afghanistan has raised serious questions about its effectiveness. One of the biggest structural weaknesses of the UN lies in the Security Council, where 5 permanent members, P5, possess veto power. This allows powerful countries to block decisions that conflict with their national interests, even if global peace or human rights are at stake. In cases like Palestine, the US veto has paralyzed the Security Council. In Kashmir, geopolitical interests and India's strategic importance have limited strong international action. In Afghanistan, decades of international involvement failed to produce lasting peace, ending with the Taliban's return to power in 2021, despite massive UN and NATO engagement. Another major issue is the absence of enforcement authority. The UN can pass resolutions and issue condemnations, but it relies on member states to implement them. When states refuse to cooperate, the UN has few practical tools to compel compliance. This turns many resolutions into symbolic statements rather than actionable solutions. Additionally, the UN often reacts slowly to crises due to bureaucracy and political disagreements. By the time consensus is reached, situations on the ground may have already deteriorated. The organization also faces accusations of double standards, where smaller or weaker states are pressured, while powerful nations face little accountability. Despite these failures, the UN remains important as a platform for dialogue, humanitarian aid, and peacekeeping. However, without reforms, especially limiting veto power, strengthening enforcement mechanisms, and ensuring equal treatment, the UN will continue to struggle in resolving conflicts. The failures in Palestine and Kashmir clearly show that peace cannot be achieved if justice is selective and power overweighs principles.